Hey there, dirt bike people. I'm Chuck from TrueTech, and today I'm going to be servicing the linkage and swing arm bearings on a 2022 300 TPI. Just because I'm working on a TPI doesn't mean that this video won't apply. It's the same for almost every full-size dirt bike on the market, European or Japanese, doesn't matter. This process takes me approximately 2 hours, including rebuilding the shock, if all of the bearings in the rear end are okay. If I need to replace the bearings, I have them on the shelf, probably add an extra half hour. First things first, obviously you need to have a clean work area, especially when we get into all the little needle bearings and stuff. If you get needle bearings that are rolling around and you have a mess, you are not going to be having a good time. I've got the rear wheel off the bench just a little bit, and I'm going to remove the rear wheel. That's first thing, get that out of the way. One of the things that I do is when I take something off the bike, I put it directly down on the bench, right next to where I removed it. Then I'll get the rear brake out of the way, just move it, pull it up out of these little things, and I usually hang it on the master cylinder there. Next thing to do is remove the rear chain guide. You do not have to remove the chain to do this service. I almost never remove it. This particular one has a nut on the back side. It's pretty common for these chain guards to get all banged up, so I'm using the Torx part of the head. Now we can just hang the chain there. Now we'll take off these nuts on this side. Now we can do the bottom shock bolt. Now we need to remove the frame guards. I always save the zip ties until I am finished putting the frame guard back on. On this particular one, there's only one bolt holding this right side frame guard on. I'm going to go ahead and do the same on the other side. Now we can remove the nut from the swing arm pivot. Now we need to remove the rear brake lever. This is going to be pretty different depending on whether you have a Euro bike or a Jap bike. I always remove the spring all the way and I leave it on the bench as a reminder. On KTMs, you want to have a look at this heim joint here, make sure it's not all seized up or worn out and loose. Now we're going to get at this bolt. Don't try and take the nut off because it's got a flat spot on the frame. Oh, use my breaker bar for this one. Oh, that's tight. Sometimes once it gets a little, oh, there we go. The nut fell right off. It's on the other side. Like I say, see there's a flat spot right here, so don't try and turn the nut. You got to turn the bolt. Now I'm going to pull this lower shock bolt out. I can push out that. Ooh, this one's a little tight. This one too. That's pretty dry. We'll see how those bearings look. I get an aluminum drift here. There she goes. There we go. Pull this one out. Now this triangle piece and this. Now the swing arm pivot. Don't push this all the way through. Leave the pivot bolt in place so that the swing arm doesn't fall out. Now we're ready to take the swing arm out. I grab it right here. I pull the pivot out. I just give it a wiggle. Out she comes. Now the top shock bolt. Oh. And it just drops right out the bottom. Now what I'm going to do is get the shock apart because I throw all the components into the ultrasonic cleaner. Now I'm not going to show you guys how to do the shock. That's a whole separate topic for a different video that I may do at some point, but the shock's going to sit in the ultrasonic cleaner while we go through and do the rest of the service. All right, 1, 2, skip a few. I've got this all cleaned up. It's very important to clean all your bits before you start taking things apart. You don't want to get dirt and stuff inside of your bearings that you're trying to maintain. Ooh, now I need to do some more cleaning. Hold up. There we go. That's looking better. Now I'm going to pull out these. Ooh. Okay. Yep. That's why we have a clean workspace. So these bearings are in pretty good shape, but there is a bunch of old grease in there and they've already started to fall out. So I'm just gonna put them all in a little cat food container. Now I've got a bit of Varsol in here. Just gonna mix these around with my finger. Get all that old grease off. These bearings are going to be in good shape. We'll put them back together. Now I should mention, if you do this regularly, you don't need to take all these needles out. These needles just kind of started falling out and the grease was really old, so I decided to do them. But if you do this every 50 hours or so, you just slide the collars out, add a little bit more grease, slide the collars back in. You can be done easily in under an hour. So there's our rollers. They're looking very nice and clean. Dump them out on a rag, dry them off. I have a thin little screwdriver that I like to use for putting the new grease in. Put a bunch of it on the screwdriver there. This is nice and dry because I cleaned it with brake cleaner and I blew it off. And then we begin the painstaking process of sticking all of these little rollers back in there, all these needles. There we go. Got them all back in there and greased. Don't be surprised if you have a hard time getting all of the rollers in. You really got to roll them all around and get them all packed in together to get every roller back in. Pay attention when you take them apart and lay them out in such a way that you will remember how to put them back together. This one has a stock set up here and then looks like an SKF set up here. I don't know exactly what that's about, but it's okay, it's all good. Oh yeah, don't forget to put your collars back in. Now, I'm not going to show you every single bearing. The concepts are the same. I'm going to do that to this one. I'm going to do it to this. This one's a little different. And I'm also going to do it to the swing arm bearings here. You guys don't need to watch me do it 10 times. You got the idea. All right, here we go. It's actually the next day. Shock is done. Reassembly begins. So on the European bikes, they have this little flat spot there, so that's going to go to the left side of the bike. They've done it really strategically. All of the linkage stuff you can access with tools from the right-hand side of the bike, so that's kind of a general rule. I put a little bit of grease, just a tiny little bit. I'm going to start with the link arm, and it's not a bad idea to put a little bit of blue Loctite in there. Again, on many of the Euro bikes, this nut is going to have a flat spot on it, and that flat spot sits against the frame, which is why you have to turn the bolt on this and not the nut. My general rule here, as with everywhere else, is as soon as you put a fastener on, you tighten it completely. It's so very, very easy to leave things loose when you start a fastener and you don't finish it. Don't do that, it's a very bad idea. The shock goes up in here, just a little bit of blue Loctite on these threads. Sometimes I don't even use it. You gotta be really careful. You don't want the Loctite to go into that bearing there. Shock up into here. Now that top bearing is actually not supposed to get grease because there's Teflon in it. Again, you don't need a whole lot of grease here because there's going to be a bunch of grease in those collars right there just from doing all the greasing that you did before. So pull the flap out of the way, pull the chain up. That's critical. Can't tell you how many times I have neglected to do that. Now sometimes these collars are a bit of a pain, so I'm just kind of manipulating them with my fingers a little bit. And wiggle it in. Now, the swing arm pivot, tap it gently if you need to. It's not quite lining up, and just gently, there we go. Now we can put our brake back. Snap it in right away. That's all part of putting all the fasteners in right away. That's something that you can easily forget. Now again, there's grease in here, so you can put some grease on the shaft if you want, but they're gonna get greased anyway. I've cleaned all these. You guys don't need to watch me do that. Now this chain can get out of the way here. We're gonna put this dog bone in here. Dog bone, triangle piece, whatever you wanna call it. Fits into the shock like that. Down here. I'll do this one first. This thing here is causing me quite a bit of grief, but these aftermarket spacers are pretty tight, which is kind of a nuisance, but no big deal. It's all kind of part of it. I can see the holes are getting close to lined up, so just getting in there with a screwdriver and just levering it into place. There we go. That's not quite lined up. You don't want to force those pins in there. You'll wreck the threads. If you got to tap it, do so very gently. Now that's lined up. Lower shock bolt. Now, I'm not going to use Loctite on that one because there's grease in there and it's just going to get all contaminated, and I'm not worried about Loctite. If you do want to put some Loctite on that, it's best to clean out the hole so there's no grease in it, and then grease a little bit on the shaft, and then put Loctite on the female threads on this bottom clevis on the other side. Again, one fastener, tight. I do these services all the time, so I don't use a torque wrench. If you're not very familiar with it, use a torque wrench. And if you're going to use a torque wrench, Make sure that the threads are all dry unless the manual states wet torque, because torque is dramatically affected by any substance that's on the threads. Torque is all about friction. Now we'll get the brake on, got the bolt through. This is one where I definitely do like to put a little bit of Loctite on it. I've seen those come loose before. Again, that's going to be different between Euro and Jap bikes. Now this spring can be quite a pain. What I like to do is put it on from the back side of the brake pedal. There we go, that's in. And now I grab it with pliers like this, and I push it into the hole with my thumb like that. Now it's time to get this chain guide in place. If it's stubborn, what I do is I put this rear one in place. Loctite on this for sure. I've seen them come loose a bunch of times. These see a lot of abuse, obviously. So I get that one in place, and now that this is solid, I can just hammer this and it'll pivot up into place. Loctite on this one too. This particular one, like I mentioned earlier, has a nut on the back. Most of them don't. Do a final tighten. While I'm over here, I'm gonna put this swing arm nut on. Now I can go ahead with this. Don't ever put Loctite on these little M5 bolts. If you want, you can put some grease on them. Now this zip tie. These zip ties are pretty easy to forget. I've forgotten them a bunch in the past. That's why I now throw this zip tie out. It's on the bench specifically as a reminder for me to put those zip ties on. Now this side, one there, one here. Snip off the ends right away. I have the two old ones here. Now they can go in the garbage. Now I'm going to remove the chain adjusters. I always do this at the end because it's easier when the swing arm is in place rather than on the bench. Pretty dry, they're not rusty yet, that's good. Put a little bit of anti-seize on them. Doesn't take much. If you're used to using anti-seize, you know that a little bit of it will turn you into the Tin Man pretty quick. We can put the wheel back. I asked this customer if he wanted a new tire, but this is actually his spare wheel and he's got a brand new tire on the other one, so. Oop. So axle goes in, not quite all the way. Then chain goes on. Wheel comes back. Axle goes in all the way. And nut. I'm pushing the wheel forward so that I get the axle spacers right against the adjusters. Axle is tight, and I always remove the wrench, put it back on, do a final tighten. My procedure. Don't forget to pump up the brake. And that's all there is to it. This is a procedure that I usually recommend gets done every about 50 hours or so. If you guys know me, you know that I don't like to give generic hourly intervals because everybody's different and every riding condition is different. So maintenance intervals are entirely custom and they need to be tailored to you and your environment. However, if you are not used to doing this, 50 hours is a good place to start. You can either go longer or shorter from there. If you found this video helpful, I would appreciate a thumbs up. If you want to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you want to see what I'm doing on a more day-to-day basis, you can find that content on Instagram. Thanks a lot for watching.